But the weird thing is he draws this distinction between religion and revelation. That religion is kind of something that everybody does unless they've been disenchanted by technological society. But basically everybody's a pagan and everybody's doing something like religion. Like I said, unless he doesn't say disenchanted, but it sounds almost Chestertonian where he's talking about how technological society has
desacralized is what he says. Yeah.
Desacralized, exactly. Yeah. So it's like the sun is no longer the source of light in this kind of a spiritual, psychological sense, but the sun is just a nuclear reaction that's happening in space. Yeah, I mean I was thrown off by the way he describes, like I said, basically that that the religious sense in the way that anybody goes about it, if there's basically any kind of a sacred feeling, even and especially the ones he describes as pagan, are basically good and are basically a step on the way to the finalization, the fulfillment of that feeling in revelation, which is distinct.
So religion to him is man's construction of his man's turn towards God, and revelation is God's turn towards man.
Right. Yeah, it's just a kind of, for me, I mean, I'm no expert, so this may be more common than I realized, but for me it was kind of a bespoke definition that I had never really come across before, and I'm not sure how helpful it is.
In chapter 6, I'm just going to read a quote from early in the chapter. He says, "The religion of a people is so much a part of its heritage that a man could no more betray his religion than betray his race. Religions are part of the richness of creation. How could Christianity destroy them when its mission is not to destroy but to fulfill when it comes to save all that has been created?" Now, he's been quite clear that the pagan religions are man-made.
Yes.
And that they need to be purified. They are subject to a lot of corruption and distortions, but still it's quite odd. Again, I think he's confusing the virtue of religion with like the cults that actually exist.
Yeah.
And he calls religions part of the richness of creation, and that we have to save all that has been created. I don't know that it's our job to save all that man has created. I could be wrong, but they're certainly not all part of God's creation.
There are things that God has allowed to happen that we don't, that are not going to be fulfilled in grace.
I think many of the works of man will simply perish.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, it kind of goes to, he talks about how religions create civilizations, and how Christendom, of course, is created by Christianity, by the church, but how all these other civilizations have also been created by... He's reifying these cultures into... I mean, he actually snaps back and forth between praising and condemning nationalism, which is interesting. And I think because he wants to say that ultimately this will all be fulfilled in the universal church. He's getting there, but that in a way, and this is the part that's kind of charming, and I think it's right that every culture is going to instantiate that differently, and that's really lovely, and I think it's exactly right. I think he goes too far when he says that basically that the East Asians were right to reject Christianity because it was presented to them in a Western way.
He says that Western Christianity, he says what they are rightly rejecting is not Christianity, but its Western form, because it destroys their cultural values. But I mean,
I don't know exactly how to draw these distinctions.
Understandable, perhaps, but not right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't, there's a distinction between, I think, I haven't put enough thought into it to be able to put it in precise vocabulary, but there's a distinction, I think, between what I'm saying, which is that Christianity will look different in different cultural contexts. That's what we mean by inculturation when we're doing it right and not just using it as an excuse to do whatever we want liturgically. But that doesn't mean that these cultures are so radically different that he's almost sounds like, and in fact, on his definition of religion, he might actually be he might actually be compelled to say that it's different religions, that the Christianity that ends up being fulfilled on this layered on top of Hinduism, that is like the fulfillment of the religious sense that comes out of Hinduism, is a different religion, again, in this bespoke definition of religion, from the Christianity that was fulfilled out of Greco-Roman mythology, or that was fulfilled.
Because he even talks about like how Christians are still pagan in some sense. Like his definition of pagan is the man-made expressions of the natural. Like, so he thinks that if it's just reduced to kind of like the level of popular devotion or ritual, even like the cult of the saints and different things like that would be pagan. He's operating on a completely different definition of the word.
I love to do that kind of thing. I love, people are like, oh, Christmas is actually Saturnalia or whatever. I'm like, great. We love taking things over and co-opting them and turning them into.
That's an example that he gives is the building feast upon the date of.
And I think a lot of that's overblown anyway. So I think they're just trying to get us with that. But the point, like even if we built it on top of a pagan feast, all the better. I mean, that's what we do. We co-opt. And when the church is at her best, when she's a confident culture-making force, when grace is when she is mediating grace to not just individuals but to families and entire civilizations, and we are just rolling on all cylinders, we are co-opting entire cultures and turning them to Christ. That's great. And I completely and to the extent that that's what he's saying that we should be doing everywhere, I'm completely on board. But he's really leaning into the kind of supernatural reality of these man-made pagan religions, that in a way that is taking it beyond to the point where it's helpful for me.
I mean, do Hindu converts to Catholicism need their own liturgical calendar based on their previous Hindu feasts or something?
Right, exactly. And that's it gets into very sticky questions, actually, the more we talk about it, because on the other hand, I mean, you don't want, it gets into very sticky questions of colonialism and to what extent Western Christian, because on his telling, it's almost like a decolonial vision before its time, where like the only way that Christianity can be authentic in these places is if it is de-Westernized. And this is, I was thinking of, I think, the not correct but also very interesting point, or aphorism of, I believe it was Belloc, that the West is the church and the church is the West, or the West is Christianity and vice versa. It's overdetermined, but the faith as it developed culturally and spiritually through the ages is a European thing. And so that so
Danielou, he kind of,
with, but I don't think he's grappling with it in the right way.
He kind of almost looks at it as though we are still converted pagans in the West, that we are still Greco-Roman or whatever, Anglo-Saxon converted pagans, as that, though, that this civilization is still an expression of that, as opposed to like, well, certainly that there's a lot of truth to that, but it's also that Christianity has formed the West into what it is. And so by that very nature, do we need to reinvent the wheel for every culture that becomes Christian? Right,
exactly. And that, and there's also, I think this,
by the way, they want one thing he notices is that these Muslim students in other countries want Western technological culture, and so by the same token, other cultures, they want classical music, they want jazz, they want it's pretty common that they want Western things in every other area of culture. So I think that It's different when it comes. It's different when it comes to imposing like Latin liturgy on the Eastern Christians or something like that.
Yeah, he actually almost says, I think he almost says decolonial or something like that, where how you said you had the quote earlier about how I think the quote I'm thinking of is a slightly different one, where he says that it comes to be seen as a kind conversion. Its conversion comes to be seen as treason, in colonial places, because it is a kind of treason against the ancient culture, against the pre-colonial culture that is trying to throw off the Western influence.
And that's certainly true in especially in, at least at the very least, in especially in high civilizations, like India, China, Japan. That's where it's most visible, where you see the most resistance.
Yeah, and like I think it's certainly a true observation, but at the same time, I guess I don't really know what we are to do with it. Yeah, it's so interesting. The more I think about it, the more it's actually deeply postmodern, this idea that he's dealing with, where he's coming at it from this way of describing religion that is very weird, but he's getting at a profound respect for non-Western civilizations that is very new, and is and there's a lot to be said for, but he's doing it through the basis of religion, precisely the thing that is most problematic about these civilizations.
Yeah, that's well put. He also does this thing where he equates the philosophy of the pagans, like he mentions Confucius and Plato.
Right.
He conflates pagan philosophy with pagan religion. And I think that it's precisely a lot of what we took from the Greeks and Romans was precisely their, not all cultures have been philosophical cultures. Yeah. Not all cultures have had philosophy as distinct from religion. Yeah. No doubt Plato was a pagan, but he also said things that were somewhat subversive of, the paganism of the day, and that sort of transcended it. So I think it's important. We shouldn't. I think that we shouldn't assume that he seems to be implicitly operating on this whole seeds of the word kind of idea from like Justin Martyr, and I think that we shouldn't assume that those are equally present. In other words, he thinks that every culture is fulfilled, every religion is fulfilled in Christianity, almost like in the way that Judaism is fulfilled in Christianity, or in the way that some of the ancient Christians thought that Greek philosophy was a precursor for Christianity. But those are, and there's some truth to that, but those are very specific, very providential. Providence is always at work, but those are moments of heightened providence. And those two examples in particular, the Hebrews and the Greeks, that we can't assume is present in the same way in every culture.
I mean, you only have to look to a place like Japan, which has proven, nearly impervious. Clearly there are cultures that are more or less ready, they're more or less kind of the philosophical, spiritual underpinnings that make it a place where the faith can more or less easily take root. I think, kind of getting to what I stumbled into before when I was talking about kind of other non-Western civilizations, I would like to say, I think it's true. I think it is absolutely true that every civilization, every culture is ultimately fulfilled in the faith. That's ultimately what the diversity of cultures must be ordered to. But that he sees these all as being constituted by religions, and that is where the fulfillment will come through, as if any kind of sacred feeling, any kind of supernatural intuition is putting you on the road, or putting you on the right path. And it seems to me that that's just not the case, that there are many examples of supernatural intuitions, sacred cultures that are quite the opposite, that leave you in a far worse position vis-a-vis the being evangelized, and that, it's a confounding way of going about it that leaves me, it's just I just think there has to be, I know there are better ways of getting to his end point, which is Christianity needs civilization, and civilization needs Christianity.
And it's clear that he believes Christianity is the only, true religion, so to speak.
Yeah.
Or the only true revelation, to use his terms.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And that distinction is so, I think it just confuses a lot more than it illuminates.
So I referred to this passage earlier, which I want to quote now. He says, People see the destruction of religion as a condition of the faith and fight against the pagan elements which live on in Christianity. They think that when atheism destroys religion, it opens a way for faith. So again, he's talking about that, that the sort of like the exporting of Western materialistic liberalism is not necessarily the most conducive kind of like midpoint to Christian evangelization. But you can't have it both ways. If you're going to acknowledge kind of the sacralization of culture and the meaningfulness of that, I think that you have to acknowledge the presence of the demonic.
Yes.
And
we've been dancing around that the whole time.
He has this line, the fathers of the church were not entirely wrong when they saw their devilish forces at work to turn towards themselves the natural movement of men's hearts toward God. Well, yeah, that's nice of you to say, they weren't entirely wrong. Of course they weren't. They weren't wrong. Right. That's what St. Paul says. He says that the sacrifices of, to idols are offered to demons.
Yes.
So, there's this really, really cool podcast. Have you heard of Lord of Spirits?
No, I haven't.
It's a podcast. It's an Orthodox podcast. It's on the Ancient Faith radio network, and it's hosted by two Orthodox priests. And somebody turned me on to this episode titled "The Land of Giants," and I have to say it's like one of the best podcast episodes ever made, in my opinion. It's like 3 hours about the Nephilim, basically, and how they're like way more important to the whole Old Testament narrative than people realize. And a lot of, but the reason I'm bringing it up is that a lot of it is about their project on this podcast is about taking the stuff that even modern Christians dismiss, like the Nephilim, or like the fact that the Old Testament refers to gods that God is greater than, as though they're real beings.
Right. Yes.
Things like that. Taking those things seriously. If you're going to fight this desacralization, then it has to go both ways. I think that you're going to get then into a more primordial conflict between Christianity and these other religions. Rather than Christianity just purifying them. I think you're going to get into something a lot more fundamentally conflicting than the kind of moral conflicts that he may, acknowledge.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, and here I think we're definitely some of it. I mean, some of this was, I think obviously it's correct in any time, but I think a lot of this is the distinction between talking about this in 2021 and talking about it in 1967. The book is shot through with a great deal of temporal optimism, which is nice to read for a change, but hasn't really panned out. And I think that as the desacralization has continued apace, and as, in fairness to Danielou, he says that a lot of the things that he's saying could be good about modern civilization, about modern technology, and so on, could become a new barbarism. That that I think has proven much more prescient than the optimism. Not fully appreciating just how far things had already gone by that point.